Welcome to the Strategy with Jason podcast. Tune in for everything you need to know to stay in the know regarding the automotive industry. Here's your host, Jason Harris.
Hey, what's going on, Podcast Nation? It is Jason Harris here, and thank you for joining me on another episode of Strategy with Jason. Today, I have a very exciting guest, a second-time guest. Why? Because we just had such amazing conversations. I decided to do a round two. Actually, no, a lot of cool things have changed, and we're super excited to jam about this. I have the one, the only, the oh-so-famous Mr. Russell Gentry in the house. What's up, Russ?
Hey, Jason. How are you?
Doing good, man.
It's always great. It never loses its flavor. You know what I'm saying?
I'm just trying. I'm having a little fun, right? Whatever. Hey, Russell, look, man, we got some great topics to talk about. And I think some of the topics we're going to kind of jam about today is kind of an extension or more of an update of kind of what we talked about our first podcast. So if you're watching or listening to this podcast for the first time, please continue to do so. But also make sure you go back and check out our last episode, which I think was in January, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, end of January.
And this is kind of an extension to that conversation. But hey, Russell, for everybody out there who's watching, listening, and kind of don't know who you are or how you got started in the industry, you know, I love starting this podcast off with a little origin story. So, Russell, how did you get started in this crazy little world we call the automotive industry?
Yeah, so it's actually, it was a crazy story, and I get asked about it a lot because the progression from what I started my adult life and career as till now are diversely different. I'm actually a retired battalion chief from the fire department, and I spent years with the fire division, and one of my final jobs as a battalion chief was state bid pricing and vehicles and purchasing and contracts and that type of thing. So I dealt with a lot of the dealers in Cincinnati, and two in particular, one of the larger Ford stores and one of the larger Chevy stores. And when I was going around and introducing my colleague that was going to take over for my roles and responsibilities, one of the dealers in particular asked me and said, "Hey, you know, what are you going to do now? You know, we think you should work for us." And I kind of, hemmed and hawed about that a little bit and pushed back. And he's like, "No, listen, we're going to do this CRM thing, and we're doing this new website thing." And this was in late 1997. So this was pretty early on for the internet piece. And he said, you know your way around tech and contracts and stuff like that. So why don't you just, consult with us and help us out on this? So I did. And the hindsight's 2020, but eventually during that process, I ended up meeting my future business partner of 12 years. We took a couple way stops along the way. They came in, they were part of the company pitching the dealer on some goods and services, in particular a CRM solution and some training. And a couple weeks after the deal was signed and everything was kind of moving on, I got a phone call, and it was my partner, and he said, "Hey, listen, I'm out in San Francisco now, and with a company named Autoweb." And this was right around 98.
Yeah,
and
so real
said,
web
really
1.0, right?
Yeah, really early. I mean, the big bad internet was going to eat the dealers. We were going to print cars out of inkjet printers, all the kind of stuff, right? And so he said, "I think you'd be really good at this. We'd like to buy you a ticket out here and talk to you." And I accepted a gig with them. I ended up learning just a ton. Payam Zamani was the principal back then. He ended up taking the company public in 99. I proceeded through the ranks, ended up being national sales director. Just had a lot of great experience and education and time spent in those early days. That company was sold in 2001 to Autobytel. I was part of what they call the six-pack national accounts that went down to Los Angeles. Spent some time there, but we had a parachute package kind of thing set up, and we were always doing things in data scrubbing, analytics, hygienes, the best that you could for the tech back then. And we decided to start our own company, and we started 4 companies. Well, we acquired one. We started 3 companies. And we ended up selling those in June of 2015. They all stemmed around data syndication, data hygiene, et cetera. And when I was done with that, that's what progressed me in my current role. I partnered with a young man named Greg Ash, a very talented developer and database administrator, and he had some ideas. And obviously, technology had progressed. So we invested in that company and took a position there, and that's where we are today.
Nice. Yeah, you know what? Data is definitely in your blood. You can just see it, like if it was intentional or not intentional, there was no way of getting around it. It's just
It just
that,
happened. I don't know what happened.
right? I think that's what it
Yeah.
is. And then I think the automotive side just made it stick more for you. That's what my guess is, right? Because that's just what automotive industry does. Is it gets in you, and it's very, very difficult to come out. And I mean, you truly are, original pioneers of just, understanding best practices and how to really utilize a dealership's data, both in their operations and their marketing efforts, marketing specifically. Now, the last conversation that we had, we talked about the cookie wars. I feel like I need some special effects to like come in
That's right.
when I
There
say
should be
that
like
or
a
something
flashing
like that.
screen or something, right?
Yeah, you know what I was thinking as I was saying that? I'm like looking at your like Star Wars like paraphernalia behind you, and I was like, I think I need something like an intro for this, the cookie wars, but no, this is a very real thing. I mean, the topic and the conversation is coming up a lot right now. I mean, every single time a dealer logs into their ad manager account, they're getting boom, hit with a notification. iOS 14 is coming. It's coming. It is. It's like doomsday or something like that. And there's a lot of big companies right now fighting for this. So I would love to get an update, because it's been a couple months since we've talked about this. But for everyone out there that's watching and listening, could you maybe just talk to a little bit about what we mean when we say the cookie wars? And then I want to get that update from you as well.
Yeah. So the cookie wars specifically are in regards to the use of third-party cookies. Third-party cookies have been around for quite some time. It's essentially a piece of code that when you go to a certain website or property, it places itself in your environment, and then it has the ability of following you and re-identifying you for retargeting ads, primarily used in the digital display arena and industry, but a lot of other platforms use it as well. That's the basic premise of, if I go to Gentry Ford and I'm looking at F-150 trucks and I leave that and I go over to ESPN to check the baseball scores, all of a sudden I'm seeing an ad in there for F-150s because it's re-identified me on an additional property. So third-party cookies are very, very common in the industry up until about 2 or 3 years ago when they started coming into question. One side of the fence says that the cookies is about consumer privacy. The other one says it's about big tech and some of the larger companies trying to control more of the ad dollars. It is a multi-billion-dollar industry.
Huge.
And for auto dealers, a ton of what they do in their space is done through this retargeting. Individuals go to their website, they look at certain VDP pages, they see certain vehicles, and that retargeting takes over.
Mm-hmm.
So the third-party cookies are basically, the clock's ticking, they're going away, their demise. The major browsers out there, Chrome and Safari, have taken significant steps in recent months and years to eliminate them. And the thought is that by the end of this year, they'll probably be extinct. And that's going to really impact the way that marketing agencies retarget and how they do display advertising and other social media advertising for car dealers.
So what would you say, for there are a fair amount of car dealers I work with and clients I work with that do a lot of their own marketing.
Yeah.
They're hearing what you're saying right now, Russell, and they're going, oh crap. Well, I mean, look, I know big agencies, like ours, can have conversations about this and how we're going to approach it, and we can come up with strategies out there. But there's a lot of dealers out there that do, a good job of handling and executing on their own ad space. What can they do? All right, to create a workaround, this cookie war.
Right. Yeah. So it's not going to be. It certainly is going to require them to kind of change their approach, as you indicated. It's not the end of the world, though. I actually, I think you and I were talking once about this. I actually think it's a good thing for dealers because it's going to force them to focus on their audiences and taking control of their first-party data, knowing who they're transacting with, the individuals that they're selling cars to, that they've sold cars to in the past. And then there's a lot of assets out there that don't have anything to do with third-party cookies that allows them to kind of create this journey that the consumer is taking and use identity graphs to take their first-party data and create, an alert system or find out where they are in that whole journey. So there's a lot of those kind of things that they can do. The other thing they can do is make sure that they're producing their own content. content that's engaging, useful, timely, relevant to their consumers, because then that's going to draw the consumer in and they're going to raise their hand. They're going to identify because they find that content useful versus just some, third-party cookie and retargeting. And we know it's a device number, but we really don't know it's Jason or it's Russ. We just know somebody clicked on an ad, right?
Yeah, you know what? I'm excited for it because, when I first started our agency, we were going to be the best video automotive specific creative shop out there. And,
Right.
at that, like this, we're talking 10 years ago, right? There were a lot of dealers that just didn't even look, they didn't need to. That's the problem. Right? They were able to half-ass their efforts by relying so much on their remarketing, that high frequency remarketing message, that it would ultimately end up generating the results they were looking for. But they didn't have to really go deep into the content and create both educating and entertaining messages. And now I feel like they're going to have to. So there's one side of my brain that's like, woohoo, let it burn.
I'm with you. Yeah.
Right? Because I want to see better creative, and we're already beginning to see better creative. I mean, I think back, the Super Bowl, those Vroom commercials seem
Yeah.
to wake everybody up and
Yeah.
say, I need to tell a story. All right. And so I saw some great dealers and dealer groups stand up and go, look, they can do it. We can do it. We have better stories to tell. So let's start telling those stories. So I saw that. Now, you had mentioned something that I wanted to kind of loop back around to, because you talked about an
Sure.
identity grabber.
Mhm.
And I think there's probably a fair amount of listeners out there that don't necessarily know what you mean when you say that. So can you define real quick what an identity grabber is?
Yeah, so identity grabber, identity graphing, identity charts, right? So it all deals with the identity of the consumer and finding different ways to associate different handles or ID mechanisms that allows you to tie that back to fully identified consumers. The world, like we're talking about, is heavily dependent on third-party cookies, but that really doesn't de-anonymize the data. That just tells us what that device is doing. We don't know that it's Jason and he's an F-150 driver today and he lives in a house that he owns.
Good
It's
point.
really just a device thing. So third-party cookies are part of it. The other way that individuals are, IP retargeting, which is very, very, it's tough to get a one-to-one identity around IP retargeting because as many as 22 different devices can use the same IP address. So the identity graph idea is to taking certain elements and tying it back to personally identifiable information and creating your own custom audience. Russ Gentry, 123 Main Street, drives a Corolla, owns his own home, etc. And there's a number of different ways of doing that out there. You can use services that will allow you to take email addresses and match back into it.
Mhm.
There's a lot of talk about hashed emails. There's a lot of talk about the made devices, the made IDs, to use that to tie it back. Really what the dealers need to do is align themselves with a partner that allows them to take the data in whatever form they have it in today and convert that into a custom audience for them.
I'm excited because, and I know a lot of self-proclaimed marketing experts.
Mhm.
There's a fair amount of them out there, right? They got a
Yes, sir.
YouTube channel and they got a camera. They can call themselves a self-proclaimed marketing experts. But what the cool thing is? I think that's going to filter out a lot of these self-proclaimed experts over the next few years, right? Because, a proper agency now has to be equally as good as telling a story and making that a very creative way to connect with a customer. And they have to understand the data and how it can actually be used so that they can actually target the right people. We have to be equally a data agency as much as a creative agency. So I love having these conversations with my team because I'm pushing them to have these to learn and better themselves and understand,
Right.
the type of information, and which I think will filter out. It will, it's going to filter out that cream rises to the top kind of scenario. So with that said, all right, for the dealerships out there watching, listening right now, and they're currently working with an agency or a marketing vendor, all right, how do they know that they're working with the right vendor or the right agency? Now, I understand that this is completely your opinion, but I want to get your thoughts.
Yeah. So I would say that as you work with your agency, and we know a lot of great players in the space. I personally have a lot of clients that we do a lot of work with agencies. I guess there'd be 3 or 4 questions that I would ask them as a dealer. The first one is that, do they white label their technology, or do they own their technology? What kind of technology are they using to produce the marketing channel mechanisms? And just kind of understand where they are, because that'll give the dealer kind of a really good idea of, how much control he's going to have or she's going to have over the process with the agency. That's number one. Mm-hmm. Number two is to have a data discussion with them, and ask them, how are you going to tell my data story? How are we going to go down this path? And what content messaging are we going to use to identify these consumers and make sure that we're getting the right message to the right people? And depending on that one, that's really going to kind of sift through these individuals that are just using canned information and that type of thing, rather than taking the data, leveraging it to the dealership's brand, the why buy message,
Yes.
why buy from Gentry Ford, and segmentation of that data. So that's probably the second bucket. The third one in general would be, how are we going to measure their ROI or the attribution, right?
Mm-hmm.
What's the real end result here? It's not to get clicks and impressions, and it's not for our Google Analytics to get that big blue mountain. It's really about engagement, right? So how many people are actually engaging with the chat software on our website? How many are calling the dealerships? How many appointments are we setting? And then what's the conversion on sold units off of that? I humbly would say, if I was interviewing an agency, I'd ask about those three things.
I think those are some great things to have discussions around. And, and a lot of dealerships out there right now are looking at their current provider or maybe a new provider. And those are some amazing questions that they can ask. I love the fact that you use the phrase data storytelling. That just sounds good. It just rolls off the tongue, right? But that is kind of what we're talking about. Like when we're thinking what the future of digital marketing is, all right, it is more about telling a story with the data that you have, or data storytelling, to your point, and then how the creative kind of supports that. So when you say, data storytelling, what do you mean by that for everyone out there watching and listening? And how does a dealer take control of that first party data?
Yeah, so data storytelling is the ability to follow the signals and the signs that are given off by the consumer, whether it's a demographic attribute about that consumer, because we know that Russ, has certain attributes. It's the signals that he's giving off online and the signals that he's giving off online in the physical world, right? And tying all those things together and creating a narrative around it. So, for example, I don't believe that I click on one Sky Tower ad or an ad for an F-150 that automatically puts me into the I'm buying a pickup truck mode this week, right? But if all of a sudden I'm working with my agency and they're leveraging different assets and we're creating this journey that the consumer is making, we see signals giving off that, they've had a lifetime change. They've just bought a house. They've just had another child into the family. Actually add that into location intelligence information. It says they've been on some lots. Putting all that together, that quilt is the data storytelling process, right? I would never want, as a dealer, just depend on a click or an impression and say, oh, boom, let's go push in and just give all our ad dollars right there. I think for me personally, knowing what we know about the data side of things, when you see all those elements lining up, that's the data storytelling. Now, once the dealer has an understanding of that, has partnered with his agency to have an understanding, then the real fun or work kicks in, which is, how do you curate the content that matches that story, that storyline, right? Mm-hmm. Sending a message to somebody that hasn't owned the car in a year is bad form, right? So one of the things we have to do is make sure that if we're trying to buy their car back, we understand what they own today, right? Just things like that in the messaging that we don't really want to stub our toe right out of the gate. Use the quilt and the storyline to support the messaging.
I love the picture, the visual of a quilt, right? Because that's really what we're doing here, right? We're taking, all of these different data points and we're kind of stitching that all together to identify the audience. And then once we have that audience defined, it's our responsibility as dealerships to present them a compelling piece of creative, not a $5.99 monthly special. Like, we gotta dig deeper. I mean, look, we're getting to the point where we're able to dig deeper on our data. Now I feel like we got to dig deeper on our creative strategies as well. So our data strategies are getting way more comprehensive. Now we have to get a lot more comprehensive in our creative strategies. Look, you get the opportunity like me to talk to a lot of dealers. So I'm sure you've seen some good examples of this, and I'm sure you've seen a lot of bad examples. Is there any from a creative perspective, is there any one example that maybe jumps up at you and just goes, hey, this was a great example where they took the data and then quilted that together with creative to create just a beautiful campaign? Anything pops up on your head?
Yeah, so in particular, there's a couple of great players in the space right now that drive price and inventory storylines back to consumers based on their behavior. And we know that, individuals, consumers, regardless of what they want to tell us, pricing and payment is always a big issue with them. So providing that information back on their current status in a way that's non-intrusive, but it looks like you're being helpful and you're giving them something as far as pricing out a payment. You're giving them the new model years of a vehicle that they've drove before, or ones that they've looked at, or the type of makes and models that they've gone to at the dealership. So there's a couple platforms out there that are very, very centric around payment and inventory. And ultimately, at the end of the day, that's what the dealers have to get really good at, is presentation of inventory. Now, you mentioned the digital retailing piece. And, it's interesting that we call it DR and digital retailing, and that it took, the COVID crisis to cause that flip. But generally speaking, the stats have been showing us for years that consumers don't want to go through that boiler room setup at any dealership. And there's a lot of great dealerships out there that avoid that, and that's not the way that they market vehicles. But this switch to digital retailing, where the consumer gets the information online and forcing us to provide more content, more video, answer questions, more connectivity in a remote way, is really, I think, great examples of platforms that dealers should use that solves that problem for them.
No, I'm with you 100%. I mean, I think, I've had the DR conversation many, many, many times. And, whenever that conversation does come up, I always have to throw a disclaimer out there for anybody watching and listening. Look, digital retailing is a process before it's a piece of technology. So please take the time, right, to develop out the process within your dealership so that you are confident that you can execute it at 100% from an operations perspective, and then work backwards towards the technology so that it can actually fulfill those operational goals. Just too often, I'm still seeing it today, and it's driving me nuts, is that dealerships are buying into DR as the magic diet pill. They're like, I'm just going to throw a widget on my site, and I'm going to sell more cars. And it's not actually how that works, but it is a great opportunity when we're thinking of like the customer experience, right? And when I think of the experience, when a lot of people think of the experience, they think of it that in-dealership experience. When me and you think of the experience, we think of it from the very first touch point. The first time a piece of creative pops up with our name on it, and every single piece of creative outside of that, plus the engagement on the website, plus the engagement inside the dealership, that is that holistic experience. And yes, those conversations are happening now, and I'm so happy that they're happening now. And things like the cookie war is going to promote pushing those conversations. Understanding, data storytelling is going to push those types of conversations, right? I think this is kind of a good segue into our next topic I was going to talk to you about, because I've seen a lot of it lately. And I don't know, maybe it's just because there are just more people online because we're at home, or what it is. But I mean, it's a lot around digital ad fry, right? Or bots. How can a dealer kind of avoid this? Because I'm seeing so much of it right now.
Yeah, so it's a big problem. It's been written and diagnosed and reported on for years. But so digital ad fraud for the dealers out there impacts every industry, whether it's RVs, cars, furniture, makeup, quick serve food, whatever. And it's basically what it is anytime you're displaying ads and the motive or the incentive of that ad is to be paid for those clicks and impressions, then there are unfortunately nefarious things out there that cause that number to go up and ad spend to go up, and it's not even a real human being, or it's being done in a fashion that's trying to drive that expense up. And it's unfortunate, But the ad fraud numbers with COVID and with more people switching to online and websites and that type of thing have only escalated. So there's things out there called bots, and we kind of touched on that. But a bot is a machine, and it just drives the clicks. There's no real way to engage and sell a bot a car because it's not a real person. And then there's things, unfortunately, offshore called click farms, where they just go in and they just click to try to drive up the ad revenue. Now, it's not 100%, it's not even 80% or 70%, but it is a significant percentage, enough that a lot of the major advertising associations in the country have really started to push to take accountability back on digital ad fraud. And that has spawned an industry of these platforms that could help dealers. There's a number of them out there. There's 8 or 9 probably in the top of their game that have certifications that allow the dealers or agency for the dealer to identify if the traffic's fraudulent or not. Is it coming through, different servers, proxy servers, et cetera, that would require or would not require the dealer to know that under other circumstances. So these platforms help. They're fairly cost effective. So it's kind of like an insurance policy. If you're spending a lot of money in display and that type of thing, you probably want to contact one of these providers.
As an agency, we're using one of those providers, and it's little bits, all right? But when I multiply this out over the hundreds and hundreds of accounts that we're running, and then I start adding this all up, I mean, there are tens of thousands and not maybe hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of dollars that are not going anywhere. And the cool thing I found, though, is that we're getting the money back. I think every single month I've found, specifically with Facebook and Google, both, I guess, is that I'm seeing credits come back like on a regular basis. So it's funny, the big story right now is the cookie wars, and then it kind of seems like the underground story that a lot of people are talking about are these click farms and ad fry. But look, if you're a dealer out there and you're watching, listening right now, and you are not working with an agency and you're taking this on yourself, which is great, good job for you. All right, you do need to understand what digital ad fry is. You do need to understand there are some great products out there. They're very inexpensive for you to be able to add to them, but will help identify, all right, just lost in money. And, in a lot of cases, you can actually get that money back, and that can add up quite quickly. I know we're getting towards the tail end kind of our time today, Russell, but I'd like to talk a little bit about what excites Mr. Russell Gentry. Because I'm always curious, right? I mean, look, we're talking about the cookie wars. We talked about, digital ad fry, but I know you're always kind of thinking of even another 5 years after that. So, with everything that's going on, everything that you're seeing within the industry when it comes to data and when it comes to marketing and now more of the digitalization of our operational efforts, what gets you excited?
Yeah, so we're doing a lot of work right now in behavioral modeling and we mentioned that quilt, and that's really what excites me these days is because we can build an image of that customer, what they want, what they need, what they're shopping for, what signals they're giving off. And I think what's going to happen is the more that we leverage data to be helpful to consumers, right? So you'll say behavioral and then everybody will get worried, or you'll say personas or whatever else. But at the end of the day, if we use data responsibly, okay, and we know that we're collecting data from all kinds of different places. We're collecting it from their phones, website visits, their movements, their transactions, that type of thing. Even though all that's collected in a compliant manner, you still have to be very responsible and respectful of the consumer and use that in a way that gives them something that's helpful. Even though it is very self-serving and it's going to be a transaction, they're going to buy a new RV, they're going to buy a car, they're going to buy a piece of furniture. The world is a very crowded and noisy place. There's a lot of attention that is it's lost in this noise called the internet because of all these websites and email blasts and IP retargeting and all this stuff. And I think the folks that figure out how to build that identity around that individual, a one-to-one identity, and says, hey, Russ would appreciate this. This is the type of coffee that he drinks regularly. This is that. This is the type of car he's driven for 15 years. And then all of the messaging then is very relevant to the consumer, I think it will feel better to them. It won't feel like their information is being, prostituted or misused if that message is helpful to them, right? It's interesting because Google just came out with some stats on the automotive side for the dealers watching. They did the Think with Google dealer handbook, and a neat document. A couple of things that stood out from there for me was that 83% of the individuals shopping for the cars are going to take up to 3 months to purchase that car, which is counterintuitive to what some places were telling us. So, that's it's up to 3 months. So there's a journey, the storytelling. There's plenty of signals that the consumers give off in that 3 months. The other thing that they indicated is that 74% of consumers going to a dealership's website they're not going to raise their hand. They're not going to put in a lead form, right? So that's 3 out of every 4 that you get that has a brand awareness, brand affinity, comes to your website, but they're not going to tell you that they're ready to buy that car. So you have to depend on these other mechanisms, and that's what's really jazzing me up these days is the ability to harvest and leverage this data in a way that we've never been able to before in a compliant first-party fashion. It's neat. I like it.
No, I'm with you. I think it's so cool how we're going to be able to really kind of laser target our efforts and our messaging according to the individual. It seems like that's been a consistent kind of conversation. I feel like for the last 15 years is that we're trying to get away from the shotgun approach and we're trying to get more and more laser targeted. And it just feels like over the next few years, it's going to get to a whole nother level of laser targeting. And I'm excited about that. There's one thing that comes up when we get to this point, as a good dealership or the automotive industry or a good agency is once we find a good thing, we'll abuse the crap out of it until it's no longer a good thing. I'm already, it's crazy to think this, but I am having some conversations with dealerships already around data overusage. What's the word I'm looking for? Data fatigue.
Fatigue.
Yes, that's the word I'm looking for. I'm looking for data fatigue, and I'm seeing this right now already happen with their retention efforts. Mm-hmm. My concern is that we're going to go forward, we're going to get these great data points, and then we're going to do the same damn thing. What kind of advice can you give to a dealership about being responsible with the data and the frequency in which they hit the specific data that they have so that they can avoid things like data fatigue?
Yeah, so that's a terrific point, because that's exactly when we empower ourselves with all this data and we start doing things, we start thinking quantity over quality to say the cliche, right?
That's what we
do.
And
we start hammering without any type of governance. So what I would say to a dealer is to institute data governance, right? And say to yourself, okay, this is our target goal is when an individual that we've sold a car to before, we want to start a cadence and a tempo to make sure we re-engage them and sell a second or a third or a fourth vehicle. But using that information and knowing it responsibly is the real trick to it, right? I think sometimes there's panic, that there's brand migration, brand defection. And sure, we see a lot of that at the tier 3 level with dealerships. But I think if you go back to what we talked about before and you're being helpful and you're providing content and almost like an online concierge, I've seen that and heard that. And I like that phrase, right? They're assisting you in this decision-making process. Remember that Google number, 83% take up to 3 months. So let's not wear the data out. Let's not, blast them over and over with emails and that type of thing. Let's make sure that the message that we do, we use it in a finite kind of controlled manner. That's the way that I would approach it.
No, you're 100% right. Look, we're really talking about reach over frequency, which is actually not a new strategy. We're kicking it old school right now, back to the TV days and radio and newspaper, where everything strategically was based on reach and frequency, right? Yeah. And I find that too often we'll take advantage of that, especially when it's so easy for us just to hit the button and just go, I'm just going to increase this. And I love the fact that you said that we got to kind of have to govern ourselves. Because, and I don't necessarily think, as an industry, we've done an overly good job in the past of governing ourselves. I mean, we will jack up the frequency on every single campaign that we possibly can, just assuming that constant bing, 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 bing in front of their face is what's going to drive them. But we have to we have to look and be responsible with these tools that we're given and that we're going to be receiving over the next 5 years. And I love that the fact that we do need to set some guidelines, govern ourselves with our data so that, our customers will continue to come back to us because they feel like we were respectful with their data, not just pounding the crap out of it all the time like we typically do. Look, if you're a dealership out there and you're watching and listening right now, these are conversations that you need to have right now already with your existing database. And then, of course, what's to come down the pipelines is data overusage or fatigue. Talk about that, have an open conversation with that. I think that's awesome. Hey, Russell, for everyone out there that's watching and listening right now, would love to kind of continue some of these conversations because we've had some great conversations so far in the last 35 minutes.
Hey, thanks for having me. This has been a blast. I love seeing when you put out new content and some other things. A lot of the guests that you've had on, I've got a little alert set up so I know when you put a new show out there. So.
That's great, and thank you for watching. Like I said, I thought my mom's the only one that actually watched this show because
well, your mom and me. So
your mom and you.
A cookie party or something, like that, hang out together or something.
And the only reason I know she watches it because I get a text message every time I use a 4-letter word. So that's the only reason.
I think we're good. I don't think we did any.
No, I don't think we didn't drop too many big ones yet. Even though when we do talk about data and we do talk about compliancy and governing ourselves, there are several 4-letter words that come to mind.
No doubt.
But for everyone out there that's watching and listening, would love to continue to have these conversations with you. What is the best way to connect with you, Russell?
Yeah, so the best way is still our website, which is m1data.com. We put a lot of content up there. We do a lot of white papers. We publish a lot of the research that we do. We're constantly testing data sets. We're very, very blessed because we have not only great automotive relationships, but we have a lot of relationships in RV, power sports, marine, hospitality, consumer goods, et cetera. So we're constantly testing out some of these strategies. Additionally, we have information on there where we have a big community of providers, just like Jason was talking about, where there's a lot of great agencies and marketing automation systems out there because it kind of takes the whole community to provide that to a dealer. So m1data.com, it would be the best way, and we would love to hear from you and continue the dialogue.
Russell, thank you so much for taking the time to jam with me today. This has been a ton of fun. You have yourself an amazing day.
Thanks, Jason. Take care.
Thanks for tuning in to the Strategy with Jason podcast with your host, Jason Harris. Don't want to miss new content? Be sure to check out the full podcast library at strategywithjason.com to stay in the know. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Happy podcasting.